Good evening, everyone. Very pleased to be with you here tonight. My name is Amanda Sutton. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks. Bookworks is a 36-year-old independent bookstore in the North Valley of Albuquerque, right down the street from the Rio Grande River. And I am broadcasting from my home office on the occupied lands of the Tiwa and Tewa people. Thank you all so much for being here. We're here tonight with Jacqueline Keeler. We were having a little chat beforehand. I'm very excited to talk to her about her new book, Standoff, which you can buy on our website. It's hot off the press from Torrey House Press, a wonderful publisher who publishes a lot on environmental and indigenous issues. Please do check out their list. Jacqueline's done another book with them called Edge of Morning, Native Voices Speak for the Bear's Ears, which is an anthology published by Torrey House. She is a writer living in Portland, Oregon. She grew up around Hanford, Washington, one of the secret cities that was part of the Manhattan Project, which we in New Mexico are quite familiar with. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about some upcoming projects and some of her family history around uranium mining. Today, we're here to talk about her book, Standoff, which looks at Standing Rock, the Bundy Movement, and American Sacred Lands. Like I said, she's coming to us from Portland, Oregon. Jacqueline is Dene and Dakota. She's spent some time right here in our lovely Albuquerque, straight out of college, so maybe we can talk a little bit about that too. She has contributed to a lot of publications, including The Nation, Yes, and Salon. Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you like to start off by telling us a little bit about your new book, Standoff?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess just that Standoff is it covers the period of 2016 when I was covering the standoff here in Oregon, starting in January of 2016, with the Bundys taking over the local wildlife refuge, and then it ends in December of 2016, where I was covering the standoff that was taking place and over the Dakota Access Pipeline on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota. Sorry.
Very nice. And what did you find? What are some important themes running throughout the book in regard to how Americans view sacred lands and how that might have changed over the years?
Well, I spend a lot of time looking at the origin stories of people, right? And contrasting the origin stories of a colonial people like the Bundys to that of an indigenous people. And I actually do a family to family comparison of ideas based on my grandmother's family's writing. And so my about the Dakota Lakota perspective in this country, going back over 100 years, and also on my grandfather Keeler's side as well. And but yeah, I really look at compare those two ideas and what these different ideas of a peoplehood, these origin stories, how these have different outcomes, how these have different sort of I see the origin stories of a people versus that of a colonial people, of an indigenous people versus that of a colonial people, as being sort of like algorithms. I go into a lot more depth on that in the book itself, but these algorithms produce outcomes. I mean, you think of them like if-then statements. What is the definition of a colonist, right? What is their origin story? And their origin story lies deeply in the colony itself. And what's the purpose of a colony but to go to other people's homelands, to occupy them, and then to transport their wealth back to the ruling class of their own of the colony's homeland, right? And of the 1%, you could say. And so I give this lecture about how the United States is still a colony, in function, if not overt stated form, and the lands that the United States occupies, those are not the homelands of United States citizens. These are the homelands of indigenous nations. And what we saw at Standing Rock was the occupation of our homelands made visible. The military nature of that occupation was made visible. And I mean, Morton County, where the sheriff of Morton County basically launched an all-out militarized assault on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. But the land of Morton County itself is occupied in violation of international law by the United States and has been since the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1869, I think. And it's here you have folks that, and the occupation is held through military power. And I think that a lot of Americans don't contend with that enough, that the land that they are on is held through military might and brutality. I mean, and if that is threatened, then that becomes very visible. And so, I contrast the colonial origin story and occupation to that of indigenous people. And I found a definition which I use in the book. I couldn't exactly use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People because it's too long, but I use this definition where I found of a people, an indigenous people with a capital P, because we often call ourselves the people in our own language. For my mother's people, the Dene people, Dene means the people, right? The original people. And the people have their origin story in the meeting with a sacred being who is a manifestation of the land itself. And in that meeting, they are given instructions and there are agreements made. Like this isn't just, they're not allowed carte blanche domination over the land, but they have to have an agreement. And in that agreement, when they make that agreement, they are made a people. At that point, they become a people. And my grandmother's cousin, he made me call him his Lala. He used to tell me that, that the Dakota people, that they did not become Dakota until they met the white buffalo calf woman. At that point, they became Dakota. Before that, we were something else, right? And so it is that moment in which you become a people, and it's your relationship to the land that makes you a people, right? And I point out that this could also be used for my mother's people, with the emergence from the third world here, and then the meeting with the holy people, and the sacred songs that are given to keep us in harmony and hojo. And so it's at this point we become a people, but we are a people whose connection to land is to a specific place. It's not the entire world, whether you're talking about the Great Plains or you are talking about the Dineta, the area between the four sacred mountains and the four sacred rivers for the Navajo people. And it's this particular nature of the peoplehood that ties us to the land and to the things that happen to the land. And so transnational corporations and colonial endeavors have none of this because they can move on. They don't share the outcomes of their activities and exploitation. And so this is sort of the crux to which I begin the book, and these comparisons between relationships to land and to identity.
You want to read a little bit from the introduction just to give people a flavor of the writing?
Sure.
And I will say that if you have any questions that come up for you while Jackie's reading or we're talking with each other, you can always feel free to type those into the chat. We'll do a question and answer at the end, but I did want her to, I wanted to give her an opportunity to read a little bit, especially from that opening scene, because it's very powerful. So take it away.
Okay. A young man holds a staff on a gray asphalt road surrounded by the prairie. It's October and the grass has turned gold and dry. The bent staff is decorated with eagle feathers. The youth, Danny Grassrope, of the Kulwichasho Yate, Lower Brule Sioux tribe, is wearing a red scarf over his head and beige pants and a t-shirt. The men wrestling with him and the staff are mostly in black uniforms, some in green jackets and beige polyester pants. Most wear riot gear helmets, a few wearing respirators, and all carrying guns in their holsters. His slight figure goes down, but still he hangs on to the staff. In the end, the law enforcement riot gear take it and pin him down, pressing his face to the soft earth and lashing his wrists behind his back with plastic handcuffs. The Lakota youth that had begun the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline had carried that staff across the country. From North Dakota to Washington, D.C., they had run thousands of miles to request that the Army Corps of Engineers reconsider allowing the crude oil pipeline to be built just a mile north of the sole intake source of water for their reservation. The young man was not just fighting for an object, but for a symbol of that prayer a new generation was carrying for the future. The staff and other personal items like sacred pipes, chompa, were later returned to the main Occhetisha Sioux camp north of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. They came in plastic bags with numbers on them, matching the numbers that were written on the owner's arms in jail. Elders I spoke to who held a ceremony to bless and cleanse them told me they smelled of urine and had evidently been peed on. How did American citizens end up on either side of the standoff? The police in the armor and the young men armed only with a staff representing the prayers of his people. The scenes of the raid of the 1851 treaty camp near the Dakota Access Pipeline construction corridor on October 28, 2016, did not resemble the post-racial America Obama's administration was supposed to usher in, an America where the lessons of the civil rights movement had been fully integrated into the power structure of the nation by the election of a Black man as leader of the free world. Instead, Obama's administration oversaw the violent arrest of 142 water protectors that day. Images of the forcible removal of the camp are haunting. Teepees ripped open by white men in military uniforms, Native people being dragged out of a sweat lodge, a Native youth leader fighting to keep a medicine staff from the police. These scenes are reminiscent of the 1863 Whitestone massacre that occurred not far from the 1851 treaty camp. Just 9 months earlier, along another state highway, Lavoy Finicum, an Arizona foster parent, is run off the road by a blockade set up by the Oregon State Police to capture the leaders of the armed takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. On the snowy roadside, surrounded by police cars, he gets out of a white SUV with his hands up. He speaks imperiously to the police, giving the impression he expects to be able to have a conversation as equals with them. In the month, the armed occupiers, led by Ammon Bundy, son of Scufflaw, Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, have held the wildlife refuge. They have enjoyed a respectful, if oppositional, relationship with the local county sheriff. They have been free to come and go from the refuge to get supplies or attend speaking engagements, like the one they are heading to now, a meeting with the sheriff in the next county and a crowd of 100 locals. Finicum obviously felt he had the standing to have a talk with those who had guns pointed at him. During an earlier media interview, when asked why he was sitting with a rifle draped across his lap at the refuge, he had said, "If you point a gun at me, you know what to expect." Now, with the police guns pointed at him, he walks across the snow and reaches a few times toward a pocket in his denim jacket. Police later allege he had a gun tucked there. The third time he reaches, he is gunned down, becoming a martyr to the cause of public lands detractors. What are we all fighting for? Are we so different from one another? What are the causes of this American standoff?
Wow, what a time. I remember hearing about those Bundys and I just thought, how in the world are they getting away with this? Well, I mean, white supremacy, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that and its relationship to the sovereign citizen movement that you cover in the book?
Yeah, I mean, this book took me so long to write, partly because I spent a lot of time investigating. I felt like I had a pretty good grip on, Lakota, perspective, but I really wanted to be able to address fluently the sort of language that was coming out of the Bundys and their supporters, and particularly their language around the Constitution, their languages around common law and common land, and which I really felt were tied to their own English ancestry and experience, and so I did a lot of research on that. It's interesting. And on the Revolutionary War itself. And so, yeah, I spend a lot of time in the book reconstructing what that means and what they're talking about, and giving a actual more accurate historical sort of perspective to what they are claiming. And the sheriffs enter into this a lot because the sheriffs played really monumental roles in both of these standoffs, The Bundys themselves have are part of a group that have an ideology that it's called the county supremacy ideology, and it was actually originally articulated by a former attorney that represented Cliven Bundy in 1993 in a case, and her name was Karen Budd Fallon, and actually under the Trump administration, she was actually made deputy solicitor of the BLM, and there was even talk of her becoming head of the BLM, and the BLM is an agency that she has sued over the years under the RICO Act, actually suing government employees who are enforcing the law as being racketeering, right? And so it's crazy that she was now suddenly the deputy solicitor of this same agency under Trump. And it just showed that, there's sort of what you see with the late Lavoy Finicum, this sort of belief that they actually are speaking for the authentic power structure of this country, right? It is actually not that far off base. Do you know what I mean? And so in fact, so it's so I really took a really careful look at that, and the history that the kind of English common law history they were invoking, right? And they were invoking their rights. They misunderstand English common law, but they were invoking their rights as colonists, which I think was accurate. Do you know what I mean? Their rights to the spoils of the land. And so I did a lot of looking at that, and also the language around the Revolutionary War. But I can tell you that in ye olde England, sheriffs were not chosen by the Anglo-Saxon commoners. They were definitely chosen by the feudal lords. And county, the term county itself comes from count, which is for an earl. And so this was a structure of feudalism, not of some sort of ancestry where English Anglo-Saxon people lived in some sort of complete democracy. That was not the case at that time. So that is an incorrect idea. But this is what they believe, right? And the name Bundy, it's so funny because the Bundys in their home in Nevada, they have a sign inside their house which reads, "Remember what the name Bundy means." So I saw that sign. I was like, huh, I wonder what it means. And so I looked it up. And what I found was that the surname Bundy, it actually comes from bound servitude. They would give their bond, their oath of allegiance to a feudal lord, and in exchange they would get land, right? And they say that after the Normans conquered England, right, in 1066, William the Conqueror and his friends, they actually killed off 90% of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. That was kind of an interesting thing I learned. Only if a girl was there to marry, they would marry her and take over her family's lands. But mostly they killed them. And after that, the Bundys became actual serfs. They were actually property that the Lord inherited when he inherited the land. So their relationship to the land is very different than Native Americans. Their relationship to the land is as property, not as actual owners. And in fact, even to this day, most of the land in England and Scotland is privately owned, and it's mostly owned by the same people who conquered England in 1066. The descendants of William the Conqueror and his friends still own most of the land in England.
Wow, that's fascinating
I mean,
stuff,
yeah.
even down to the names of these people, right? So it seems like a lot of this stuff is actually steeped in language and ideology. And you're looking at this movement called the sovereign citizen movement, and it's really just butting up against the idea of sovereignty of native nations too. Could you talk a little bit about that, and what effect that has on the idea of sovereignty when it comes to native peoples and lands?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I really looked quite closely at was the Revolutionary War itself, because a lot of the language they're using comes from that time period. They're evoking it, and so what I found was actually that so. Jefferson, of course, President Jefferson was famous for declaring after the Louisiana Purchase that this would then, he was an advocate of the yeoman farmer democracy, a democracy composed of farmers, people who own their land, right? And he had declared after the Louisiana Purchase that this would be able to provide farms for 1,000 years of Americans, right? And of course that wasn't the case, but is interesting because, of course, this was actually a revolutionary idea in a feudal Europe where most people did not own land. I mean, we're talking about 99% of the people did not own land. Most English people lived in dire poverty, and this was the norm. Just even up into Georgian times, the very cream, the elite that like Jane Austen writes about, that was a very small group of people. The millions lived mostly in dire poverty, and so this is what I actually propose is that the Revolutionary War was a war between elites between on this side of the ocean and elites on the other side of what they call the pond, and and because if you look at the founding fathers, most of them were the richest men in their era, right? You keep seeing that terminology describing founding fathers. And most of them were also had interests in these land companies. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you will notice that after you go past the first few that everyone reads, you go further down, and it's all about basically King George III siding with the Indians. Right. This was the treaty, the settlement after the French and Indian War. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the French and Indian War, that settlement was actually the cause of the Revolutionary War. And it's called the 7 Years' War in Europe. And the French and Indian War is also called World War Zero. Most historians view it as the First World War. Right. And the person who caused the First World War was actually George Washington himself. Right. As a young man, he was like 20, 21 years old. He was sent by the Commonwealth of Virginia to lead like a militia group up there to defend the Commonwealth of Virginia's interests in the Ohio Valley, which they had under their charter. Right. And so this war, and I should note that one of the things I address is the issue of the corporate structure of the world today, of capitalism, and how that really went hand in hand with colonization. When I was covering the Keystone XL pipeline in 2013, 2014, I interviewed a lot of farmers and ranchers, white farmers and ranchers from South Dakota and Nebraska. And I remember interviewing one of them, and he was in a state of shock. He was like, he could not believe that the US government had given governmental powers of eminent domain over his land to a foreign company, TransCanada, right? And it was a total shock to him. And I was looking at him going, don't you know the history of this country? I mean, this is actually the basis for the early it was these joint stock companies that funded colonization and exploration and were given governmental powers over the lands that they discovered by the crown, by the English crown, and because the crown could not afford to fund it. And so you have, of course, most famously, the Virginia Company of Adventurers in London, which were given governmental powers over Virginia and even up into Plymouth, where they had dominion. And and of course, other like, of course, in India, you have all of these companies that led the way to colonization and sort of the imperial empire that followed for the British around the world. And so this is a fundamental part of America, right? Is capitalism, is the growth of transnational corporations. This is actually part of the origin story of this country, and it's fundamental to the DNA of this country. So anyway, you have these land companies that all the founding fathers are invested in. What's his name, Mr. Morris of Morristown, who was one of the main funders of the Revolutionary War. I mean, after the war, he got half of New York State, which was Iroquois land, right? And but they were basically in opposition to the Proclamation Line of 1763, which was issued after the French and Indian War, which meant that the colonists could not go west of that line, which was along the Appalachian Mountains, right? And I should actually go back and say the way that George Washington started the war as a young man, this World War, was that he bungled his assignment. It led to the accidental death or killing of a French diplomat. He was forced by French soldiers to sign a letter in French, which he could not read, saying that he was at fault. And this was the start of this war that went all over the world and actually doubled the national debts of both Britain and Actually, I guess it was still England, but of Britain and of France, right? And it was actually this debt that the colonists were being forced to pay part of, and this is why they were being taxed, because they had started a world war, right? They had saddled their home country with all this debt, and of course, you know, the British citizen in England did not have any say over this war, and it was started by the colonists in their hunger for land, right? Because the whole thing only worked if you had more land, right? And so they constantly were feeding and needing more land, and so this is what caused the war. And so they and so this goes against sort of the propaganda that we are taught about the Revolutionary War, that we are being unfairly taxed, the colonists were being unfairly taxed, and also the quartering. The quartering was done so that they could actually keep the colonists out of Indian land. And this is why in the Declaration of Independence that they call us merciless Indian savages, because of the Proclamation Line of 1763. Right. And so once they win the war, it's a huge land grab going, you know, across New York State. The Iroquois Confederacy, which stood for 1,000 years, falls. You know, all these wealthy men get all the land and they get to sell it off to everybody else. And then you get the Ohio Valley. And of course, you know, the Act of the Northwest Territories, where they decide how they're going to divvy up into states the remaining land they have, and the land that's gained under the Louisiana Purchase. So this is where, to answer your question, this is a long way of answering your question about how does the notion, the colonial notion, how does it intersect and how does it impact the sovereignty of Native nations, and how has it continuously done so and been an aspect of it? And so the notion is then that all these people will get land and they'll be able to be yeoman farmers, which they cannot be in Europe, right? And then they can participate in democracy as Jefferson would like them to. So this is so this is a very different take on the Revolutionary War than what the Bundys believe, right? Not to say the Bundys have a great historical understanding of history, and that's where I'm saying that this is about power. In the end, storytelling is about power. It's about telling a story that empowers you. And that's what they're about. They're not necessarily about accuracy, right? They're about the sort of leveraging of storytelling for power. And so this is, and you can see that they know that they have a direct line to powerful people. I mean, after the Hammonds were released, that was the ranchers that the Bundys were fighting for in Oregon. After they were released, they were pardoned by Trump, and they were met at their prison by a billionaire who flew them home on his private jet. So they know. I mean, that's why they're smirking, because they know that they have direct, and the things that they are doing are useful to powerful people, right? It's a useful thing. So so this is sort of, but I go into a great deal of detail over the Enclosure Act and how that impacted England and everything like that. So it took a lot of research, and I think I have sort of framed this history in a way that's more useful to us than propaganda is. I think that the goal of my writing is to be able to frame our present struggles in terms that we can actually come to some answers that are actually useful to all of us. And just, I think when we only have propaganda, then we can't come to those answers. And when I give my lecture on how the United States is still a colony, I end it, addressing the audience, which is usually mostly white, asking them, you're a good person, right? You are a colonist, right? So my question to you is, what would ethical colonialism look like? Right. And it sounds like a specious question, like not a serious question, but it's actually the very question that is presented by the very of them being born as colonists. I mean, this is the question of their lives, the crux of their very identity and their experience, and it's really what they have to meet. And so, the goal of bringing, I don't have a lot of cultural capital as a white person, right? But I do have cultural capital as an indigenous person, and this is what we're bringing to bear to the table. As I made a point in my previous book, Edge of Morning, I addressed the issue of, well, what about jobs? And because when we were covering the issue of the Bears Ears National Monument, what I kept hearing from white people in Harney County, I mean, in San Juan County, Utah, was, well, what about jobs? What about jobs? Because the colonist is always very concerned with jobs, and Indian people are too. I shouldn't be too, but anyway, it's the circumstances demand it. And so I really tried to address that in my chapter there about that, and I really looked at the issue of this indigenous relationship, this origin story, which provides us a relationship to the land, and out of that comes socio-political structures that are different than what you see in the rest of the world. And from this came this interaction with colonists and intact indigenous nations, particularly the Iroquois Confederacy. It came the ideas of democracy and also of women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Victoria Gage, they got the idea from meeting. Seneca Falls, New York, was adjacent to an actual Seneca village in New York, and that had remained after the Revolutionary War. And they got to see for themselves, to see these Seneca women reorganizing their government. And this was amazing to them because they lived in a time period when women were legally dead, right? And to see women, and so then it made it much more real to them that this could be possible. And you read that in their speeches at Seneca Falls, that they are pointing to this other community saying, look, it's being done right before our eyes, right? And so these concepts, these socio-political concepts that indigenous people carry from their relationships as a people to the land itself and to each other, have value. Because what I ask in the thing is, like, I compare that to the Potosi silver mines in Bolivia, which, despite having all this silver, the King of Spain still declared bankruptcy 5 times, at that time period. And but the wealth that's accrued through women's rights, through women having a real the freedom to live their lives, and to pursuing careers that are meaningful to them, right, and rights over their own bodies. That has what would be the value of that? Could you put a monetary value on it? And people actually have done studies to see, and they have found that communities where women have rights, particularly over their reproductive rights, have experienced huge gains. It helps the entire community economically. And so, these ideas that Native people have are not simply, fanciful ideas. These are ideas that have made the world that we live in today fundamentally better, right? And of course, even crops and stuff that comes out of our relationship to our homelands, to these plants, and this has fed the world, right? All of the major crops are from Native people in this hemisphere. And so there is a notion that this relationship that we have and the way we do it may actually have benefits beyond what simply, what people realize, and that differ from the colonial model, and even the imperial feudal model. Do you mean?
That's why I love books like this, right? Because it's basically taking all that old, so-called American history that you learn in school and exposing all the holes, exposing all the things that you just take as being true because you're fed those lines and that propaganda over and over and over again, without acknowledging that our actual history here on the land is one that's not as old as the indigenous viewpoints, and that we have taken so much of those ideologies and just claimed them as our own, right? So I want to talk a little bit more about Bears Ears, because I know you've done a lot of work around there. And we saw definitely during the last presidential administration some definite, regression on how we treated sacred lands and native lands. And just talking a little bit more about the very exciting hire of our new Secretary of the Interior, one of our very own, Deborah Holland here from New Mexico. What I want to ask you is that, do you think that there is some good positive momentum around preserving and respecting sacred lands compared to the past? And if you see us moving in a better direction because of her hire or because of anything else that's happening in the socio-political environment.
I think so. Yeah, I'm excited about. I mean, it's astounding that a Native woman is now in charge of. Is it quite a great bit of the land area of this continent, Jamie, of this country, and it's be amazing to see what she does with that power. I'm quite hopeful. I think on the other hand, of course, is the issue of which I bring up in the book, and when addressing the issue of Obama overseeing this militarized assault, his administration, on an Indian nation, I point out the fact that you have to know what vehicle you are driving. If you're in the driver's seat, are you if you are driving a colonial machine, right? It's like driving a combine harvester. It will do what it's meant to do. It's the structure's already in place. And but if you are, what you have to kind of ask that question. And so the person in the driver's seat, what can they do? And so this will be a really interesting moment. I am hopeful, though. I really do hope that it speaks to something. I think that the kind of questions, the comparison that I've done between these two different political structures and countries and peoplehood and all this stuff and relationships, I hope it's helpful in beginning to provide answers. I think that we need to fundamentally remake our relationship between, with Indigenous nations with the U.S. government, and that's the ethical colonialism aspect of it. I think we need to sit down at the table and remake this. We're not this trust relationship, right? Not keep our lands in trust, but keep them sovereign. Allow us, international recognition, a seat at the table internationally at the UN. All of these things need to be redrawn. And I'm hoping that what's coming of age now in America in the next 20 years is a generation of leaders who can do that. You look at AOC and the Squad and, Stacey Abrams, and we are looking at the rise. And of course, the white supremacist structure is fighting back quite rigorously, as we saw in Georgia recently, with the repressive election laws. But we may have, in the next 20 years, a table to sit down at and to redraw this relationship. And we need to understand our situation very well, and we need to be able to present a plan. And it's a plan that not only provides justice for us, but allows Americans to address their colonial sort of identity in a way in which they can, rather than pretend to be us or pretend to be Indian or these sorts of things, they can actually remake what their colonization means and try to ameliorate it in some way, which is the thing that I think any thinking, feeling person would want to do. You know.
Absolutely. What role do you see treaties maybe playing in that or not?
Treaties are very interesting. I think that one of the things I bring into this book as well is, and it's been covered by many other people, obviously, and it's just a fundamental part of Indian federal law, is the issue of domestic dependent nations, that sort of concept, and also the idea of oh, what is it? I'm forgetting. The idea that Native people cannot own land. Right. This is a fundamental part of the title the U.S. claims to this land, the Doctrine of Discovery, which was first put forward in the late 1820s by Chief Justice John Marshall of the Supreme Court, and basically stating that he had to make a case where he had to decide whether two men who claimed the same land, right? One had acquired title by purchasing it from the tribal nation, and the other one had acquired it through a state. And he had to decide which title was actually valid. And he decided that Native nations do not have title, right? And this was the Doctrine of Discovery is based on a couple of papal bulls passed in the late 1491 and 1550, and they basically state that that only discovering Christian nations who were under the Pope had title to the land. The minute they landed on our land, they would land at sort of the open mouth of a river and then claim the entire watershed, right? And they would basically, once they set foot on there, that the land to the title immediately reverted to the actual European discovering nation, right? That the only title that Native people possess is that of animals, of occupation and use, right? And so we have no title. right? Which is extraordinary because there really are no other people in the world that don't have title to their land. I mean, we might disagree with Pakistan, but we don't say they don't have title. I mean, it's a very dehumanizing thing, and yet this is actually fundamental to U.S. claims to the land here.
Yeah,
And
maybe Palestinians, it sort of reminds me of the situation that they're in as well.
exactly. Yes, exactly. So they so what so he even though the US didn't exist in 1550 or 1492, what Chief Justice Marshall said was that I mean the US government had inherited that status from its because it's a colony of England, right? Or Britain. And so so this is the basis the of the claim to our lands, and it's a fundamentally immoral one. And I think that more Americans need to really contend with that and change that. But of course, that threatens, the power of the United States. And I suggest that this is the reason why our political identity is suppressed, because the recognition of it would make the whole house of cards come tumbling down. And so this is why they would prefer to keep our political identity quite fuzzy, and but yeah, that's I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
I think you did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to get to some of our questions from the audience now, too. So we have Professor Mahezawa. The comment is there are a lot of investigative journalism books, but I'm not aware of many others besides maybe Krakauer that have a profound personal connection to the topic like your work does. And I know we were talking before about some of your ancestors too, which I think is really fascinating. What would you say, though, to writers who want to write about crucial Indigenous issues? I'm not sure if I'm assuming that the questioner means Indigenous people writing about Indigenous issues, but I suppose you could talk about both.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, I was being interviewed today by a magazine, and I was saying that, this book actually opens with oral stories that were told in my father's family, three stories. And I put them in there because I wanted people to understand, when when we write and speak, we mostly are referencing Judeo-Christian cultural ideas, right? And maybe, also Greco-Roman, ideas as well. Uh, but and we all share that language. We have different levels of fluency, in all of those things, from Aesop's fables to the Old Testament, right? And but we are not as familiar with these same native ideas and stories. And so I felt it necessary to put those in there because these are fundamental to my understanding of what was going on at Standing Rock, as a member of a Dakota family. And so I think that, and I told this journalist that I could not have written this book if I was not raised by my parents. I mean, if I had been removed from my family, in the 1977, a study was presented at Congress, which found that 25 to 35% of Native children were being removed from their homes, right? And and I many years ago I wrote an essay that was published pretty widely about Thanksgiving, right? And I wrote in there how my mother, when I was going to kindergarten, she sat me down, and she was, I was like 5 years old, and she was like, do not believe anything you hear in school. They will tell you things about Indian people, but those are not true. And then she also sat down and told me how the US was created out of land stolen from our people. And at 5 years old, I was so angry. I was this little creature. I was so mad. And that immediately gave me a perspective on things, and she was like, I will teach you, I will tell you what our people are like, and your family, these things that they will try to say are not true, right? And so, you are immediately put at odds with dominant society, right? And then that, and I wrote in that essay how at that moment I knew that my family had some sort of inside perspective on this beast, this America, right? And that we carried this knowledge as a small little family, and so living off the reservation. And so it's so I wanted to imbue the story with some of that, because people need to understand our perspective, because our perspective has been so powerful in transforming and creating the modern world, with, once again, getting back to the ideas of democracy and women's rights, and of, of our relationships. I think it's fundamentally changed that, and been a force in opposition to feudalism and authoritarianism. So I think it's really valuable to bring that to the table, because if we don't, then who would? And that this perspective alters other people's perspective and provides answers that were not apparent beforehand. Like when I ask my audience, what does ethical colonialism look like? You are a colonist. It immediately completely changes their viewpoint of their world, and presents an entirely different sort of path to go down to find answers.
Great question to ask. We've got one from James Hickerson. Does your book source the material you consulted, which would be useful to those of us trying to communicate the messages?
Yeah, they are sourced. Yeah.
Okay, that was an easy one.
Yeah.
We've got one from Helen. The media seems to have overlooked the critical through lines from the Bundys to the insurrection of January 6th. Some who were threatened that day are now promoting denial. What threads do you see that might inform us about those insurrectionists?
Yeah, that was what's so fascinating. I mean, I think it's the violence, I believe is going to continue. And that's why I think it's very important to find solutions, to find a third way, right? To identify that. I think I don't know. I mean, I don't, having studied the armed right for so long, I am unsure that anything I can say can actually reach them in any sort of thoughtful way. I think that, to me, I believe a lot of the solutions are structural, and these are solutions that must change our relationship to each other fundamentally, and so that's why I think that we need to rethink America. We need to not sit on our laurels. We need to rethink it. We need to challenge the history as told to us, and we need to come up with a different way of addressing where we are and what we are. So I think it's absolutely crucial. Otherwise, I don't mean to be alarmist, but otherwise there will be a lot more violence, and I don't see the armed groups standing down. It's the level of I mean, it's the research I'm done. I'm not going to cite it all here, but I definitely would recommend listening to the second season of Bundyville, the podcast by Leah Sotil, which really goes into an amazing amount of detail on these groups, and they really have a deep history going back to the late 70s, early 80s, and the way in which they have been really working at this for quite a long time, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest, north of Spokane and Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. So it's not going away. It's going to continue to happen. There's going to be something terrible that's probably going to happen, and we really need to put a lot of thought into it. So that would be.
Couldn't agree more. Sadly, the people that need to be reading this book are not going to.
Well, I hope that, I hope that the way in which I reframed some of this history will actually encourage other people to write about it, and maybe after a while it will percolate out and become more accepted. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
And I mean, a lot of the stuff people know. I mean, most historians know George Washington started the First World War, but most Americans do not know this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And so, I think that this sort of reframing other people have to also participate in it and react to it, and then we can begin to have a conversation that will eventually reach a much larger group.
absolutely. All righty. Does anyone else have any questions? I'm going to give you one last call to type those into the chat if you would like. Jackie, do you want to tell us a little bit more about any future projects you're working on? I know we were talking a little bit earlier. I don't know if you're at liberty to say, but I was quite intrigued by some of the other things that you're doing. Would you like to just give us a little flavor?
Yeah, so I'm working on, well, I have a couple of my next book that I have been talking to Tory House about is about the uranium mining issue, uranium in Indian country. And so we've been looking at that. My co-editor has been really busy with the mutual aid issue for COVID and stuff. So, but we're looking forward to working on that some more. My Navajo grandfather was a uranium miner, and there are over 200 abandoned uranium mines around Cameron, Arizona, where my mother grew up. It's on the near the south rim of the Grand Canyon on the Navajo Nation, and there are over 500 abandoned uranium mines across the Navajo Nation, and so. But the other thing I've been working on, which I was talking to you about, is, well, two things. One is I've been doing an investigation of alleged pretendians. I had worked on creating the hashtag Not Your Mascot in 2014, and I noticed that people were really quite attached to their desire to do red face and their mascotry, and then I see that the pretendian issue is on the spectrum of that sort of red face. And as a journalist, what I began to discover was that it was much more common than I realized. And so, after the Canadian Broadcasting Company did an investigation of Michelle Latimer, a filmmaker and showrunner there in Canada, finding that she did not actually have ties to the tribe, to the nations that she was claiming. And then later it came out in January of this year that the New York Times had published an op-ed by a woman who had actually stolen the tribal identities of her late husband. And she had written the signature opinion piece celebrating the nomination of Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary for the New York Times, which is the paper of record of this country, was written by a fraud. And it was her giving advice as a Native woman to Deb Haaland, an actual Native woman. And so I was quite appalled. And so I started just assembling the list, we got to 190 people, and we sort of froze it there. We have many people, other people that they want us to look at. And these people are all people who profit off of their identity. These are not private individuals, and of which we could not immediately ascertain whether their claims were true or not. And so, but so far we've looked at, well, the last count we had done some data on was we did about 60 of them, and we found that only 4 had any ties to any tribes. So we're talking about a fraud rate of 93%. Of course, this list is not a random sample, but it's still pretty concerning. And so, as you know, that's a really depressing sort of line of work. I really celebrated when we found a fourth person who was actually Native. That was like, yay! It made me happy, because it was very depressing, and because I'd only thought when I started that the actual fraud rate would be between 10 and 20%. I thought that what we'd be finding is that people had just very distant relationships. And I was going to measure how distant and what was the average, like, is it 5, 6 generations back? Is there bias in favor of people who have very distant ancestry over people who are actually federally enrolled, and that sort of thing. But it wasn't that at all. It was just that people were actually straight up lying. And that was very shocking, and a shocking insight into humanity. So I've been working on a novel, and that's been my escape from everything. And it's a novel about the discovery of Kennewick Man at Hanford, which is a nuclear waste dump. It's like the worst Superfund site in America. And so looking at the history of the creation of the atomic bomb, and the waste that we still live with, that we will continue to live with for 10,000 years, that the threat of Hanford is real. uh, it's really shocking. I mean, people really have a hard time even keeping I don't know, I tell people about Hanford, and then the next thing I know is they've forgotten about Hanford. It seems like there's like an invisibility spell over Hanford, but it's far worse than Fukushima and Chernobyl. Uh, I was reading some of the data, and one soda can of the plutonium waste there, if it was spread throughout the hemisphere, would kill 10 to 30 million people. It's quite bad. And actually, there's a threat that the plutonium, which is very sludgy, it could have, if it's not moving properly, it can actually begin its own nuclear chain reaction, even in the tanks where it's stored. it's off-gassing terrible toxic gases as well, and that basically it would create an atomic, I mean, a really serious, I mean, we're talking about, was it let's see, 50, 30, we're talking many times that of Fukushima and Chernobyl, 7 times, I would say. So far worse, and that would basically make most of the Pacific Northwest unlivable. And so, and that could happen at any moment. It could happen tonight. It could happen tomorrow. It's something that hangs over our heads. And even with the vitrification solution, turning it into glass, that they built, the facility they built is like a black box. Once they get it started, they can't go in and fix it. It would just be too radioactive, and even that could explode, like, and create and make this whole area unlivable. And so it's really dangerous. People don't think a lot about it. It's, we could stop every pipeline, and then the next minute Hanford goes off, and we can't live here anymore. I mean, for 10,000 years. It's that bad. And so people, I hope you don't all forget Hanford the minute I stop talking about it, but you probably will. So I'm writing a novel, so maybe it'll stick more in people's minds.
I don't think I'm going to forget about it. You talked about some frightening things here tonight. The explosion of white supremacy, the explosion of these just environmental sites that need to be contended with. Thank you so much for your work, folks. Get a copy of Standoff. You can get it at bookworks.com. It's our website without the O, or our name without the O's, BKWRKS.com. Jackie, do you have a website where people can get a list of your virtual events or other things that you're working on?
Yeah, I have a Facebook page, Jacqueline Keeler, and also I'm on Twitter at JF Keeler and Instagram.
Cool.
And I'm sort of trying to get into TikTok. I haven't really done much, and I have a blog called Tioshbaya Now, so you can check that out as well. But yeah, I have mostly, I think I keep things up to date on my Facebook page.